The gunshot that shattered the peaceful afternoon wasn't what brought Sheriff Declan Xavier to the Greenwood ranch that freezing December day in 1881, but rather the desperate telegram that had arrived at his office an hour earlier. Its words scrawled in obvious panic about a missing girl and a storm rolling in fast from the mountains. Declan urged his horse forward through the deepening snow, his breath forming white clouds in the bitter Colorado air as Westcliff disappeared behind him. The wind had picked up considerably in the last 20 minutes, carrying with it the promise of something far worse than the gentle flurries that had started at dawn. He'd seen blizzards like this before in the high country, storms that could bury a man and his horse in less than an hour, storms that made even the shortest journey a gamble with death itself. The Greenwood ranch came into view just as the wind began to howl in earnest, the sturdy log buildings looking small and vulnerable against the vast white expanse of the valley. Declan had known Thomas Greenwood for 3 years now, ever since he'd taken the sheriff's badge in this remote mountain town. The man was a hard worker, fair-minded, and devoted to his only daughter, Sarah, which made the telegram all the more concerning. He dismounted near the main house, his boots crunching through 6 inches of fresh powder. Before he could knock, the door flew open and Thomas himself appeared, his weathered face creased with worry that went deeper than the lines age had carved there. "Sheriff Xavier, thank God," Thomas said, grabbing Declan's arm and pulling him inside. "She's been gone since noon. Rode out to check the eastern fence line and never came back. I was just about to saddle up myself when the storm hit." Declan shook the snow from his hat and coat, his sharp blue eyes taking in the scene. Thomas wasn't alone. 3 other men stood in the parlor, ranch hands by the look of them, and a woman Declan recognized as Martha Henderson from the neighboring property. "How long has it been?" Declan asked, though he already knew the answer would be too long. 3 hours now. "She knows these mountains, Sheriff, but in this weather." Thomas's voice cracked. "She's all I got left since her mother passed." Declan moved to the window, watching the snow fall in thick, angry sheets. The temperature was dropping fast, and visibility was already down to maybe 20 feet. Going out there now would be suicide for man and horse alike, but waiting could mean Sarah Greenwood's death. Did she take supplies? Extra clothes? He asked. Just her regular riding gear. She wasn't planning to be gone more than an hour. Thomas ran a hand through his gray hair. "She's a capable girl, Sheriff. Smart, strong, but nobody can survive this without shelter." One of the ranch hands spoke up, a young man named Pete. "There's the old line shack about 3 miles east. If she made it that far before the storm got bad, she might have holed up there." Declan nodded slowly. "That's where I'll start. The rest of you stay here. If I'm not back by morning, don't come looking. This storm will pass in its own time." "I should go with you," Thomas protested, but Declan shook his head firmly. "You know I'm right. I've got the best horse in the county and I know how to read weather like this. 1 man has a chance. 2 men just means 2 people to dig out come spring." The harsh truth of it silenced any further argument. Declan pulled his coat tighter and wrapped a thick wool scarf around his face, leaving only his eyes exposed. He'd survived worse than this during the war, though not by much. The key was to keep moving, stay oriented, and trust your instincts when your eyes couldn't tell you anything but white. The moment he stepped outside, the full fury of the blizzard hit him like a physical blow. The wind screamed across the valley, carrying snow so thick it felt like riding through a solid wall. His horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Copper, snorted nervously but held steady as Declan mounted up. "East," he muttered to himself, trying to fix the direction in his mind before the landmarks disappeared entirely. 3 miles east to the line shack. What should have been a 40-minute ride turned into a nightmare journey through a world gone mad with white. Declan kept one hand on the reins and the other checking the compass he'd pulled from his saddlebag, though even that was difficult to read in the swirling chaos. Copper stumbled twice in hidden drifts, and each time Declan's heart lurched with the certainty they were both going to die out here. But the horse kept going, head down, following some instinct Declan could only trust. Time lost all meaning. It could have been an hour or 5 when he finally saw the dark shape looming through the snow, the outline of the lined shack barely visible against the white backdrop. Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by renewed concern. If Sarah wasn't here, she was already dead. He dismounted and led Copper toward what he hoped was the lean-to attached to the shack's north side. The structure was still standing, thank God, and he got the horse inside and loosely tied before fighting his way to the shack's front door. It was barred from the inside. "Sarah Greenwood," he shouted, pounding on the rough wood. "It's Sheriff Xavier, open up." For a moment nothing happened, and Declan wondered if perhaps some drifter had taken shelter here. Then he heard the bar scrape free and the door cracked open, revealing a young woman's face, pale and frightened in the dim interior. "Sheriff." Sarah's voice was hoarse, probably from calling for help earlier. "How did you? The storm." "Let me in before we both freeze," Declan said, and she stepped back quickly. The shack was a single room, maybe 12 feet square, with a small iron stove in the corner that was putting out blessed heat. Sarah had clearly been here for a while. Her horse was visible through an interior door that led to the lean-to, and she'd managed to get a fire going with the emergency supplies kept in the shack. Declan closed the door behind him and sagged against it, snow falling from his clothes in heavy clumps. Now that he was out of the wind, he could feel how close he'd come to the edge. His hands were numb inside his gloves, his face burning with the cold despite the scarf. "You came out in this." Sarah was staring at him like he'd lost his mind. "You could have died." "Your father sent for me," Declan managed through chattering teeth. "Couldn't leave you out here." She moved to help him out of his coat, and for the first time Declan got a good look at her. He'd seen Sarah Greenwood around town before, of course, but always at a distance. She was younger than him by about 6 years, which made her maybe 22 or 23, with dark chestnut hair that fell past her shoulders and green eyes that held an unusual sharpness. Pretty, certainly, but there was something more than that, a quality of self-possession that was rare in anyone, man or woman. "Sit by the stove," she ordered, and Declan was too cold to argue. She brought him a tin cup of water from the barrel kept in the corner, and he drank it gratefully. "How long have you been here?" he asked when he could speak normally again. "Since about 1 o'clock. I saw the storm coming and made for the shack. Barely got inside before it hit full force." She settled onto the floor across from him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "I knew Papa would worry, but I figured he'd have sense enough not to send anyone out in this." "He didn't send me. I volunteered." Something flickered in her eyes, an emotion Declan couldn't quite read. "That was foolish." "Probably," he admitted. "But I took an oath to protect the people of this county. That includes stubborn ranchers' daughters who don't check the weather before riding out." A hint of color touched her cheeks. "I checked the weather. It wasn't supposed to hit until evening. Mountain storms don't care about schedules." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the wind howl outside. The shack creaked and groaned under the assault, but it held. These lined shacks were built solid, designed to withstand exactly this kind of weather. "How long do you think we'll be stuck here?" Sarah asked quietly. Declan considered. Storm like this could be 12 hours, could be 3 days. No way to know. 3 days. Her eyes widened. But that would mean. She didn't finish the sentence, but Declan knew what she was thinking. A man and woman, alone together for 3 days with no chaperone and no witnesses. In a town like Westcliff, that would destroy her reputation beyond any hope of repair. "We'll deal with whatever comes," he said firmly. "Right now, staying alive is what matters." Sarah nodded slowly, but he could see the worry in her face. It wasn't a small thing, what the town would say. Declan had seen women ostracized for less, their lives effectively ruined by whispers and sideways glances. The afternoon wore on, the storm showing no signs of abating. They took turns feeding small pieces of wood into the stove, careful to conserve the limited supply. Sarah had packed some jerky and hardtack in her saddlebags, and they shared a sparse meal as darkness fell outside, though the white fury of the blizzard was so complete it was hard to tell day from night. "Tell me about yourself, Sheriff," Sarah said eventually. The silence had stretched between them for over an hour, and Declan suspected she was trying to keep both their minds off the cold and the situation. "You're not from Colorado originally, are you? I can hear it in the way you talk." "Missouri," Declan said. "Grew up on a farm outside Springfield. Joined up when the war started, like every other fool boy who thought it would be glorious. And after the war, drifted for a while. Didn't want to go back to farming, couldn't settle down. Worked as a deputy in Kansas, then a town marshal in New Mexico. The sheriff's position here opened up 3 years ago, and Westcliff seemed like a good place to finally put down roots." Sarah studied him in the flickering firelight. "No family, not anymore. Parents died of fever in '68. Had a brother who died at Shiloh." The words came easier than they used to, the grief worn smooth by time. "What about you? Your father said your mother passed 2 years ago, pneumonia." Sarah's voice went soft. "She was the heart of our family. Papa and I were too much alike. Both stubborn, both proud. Mama was the one who kept the peace between us." "Is that why you were out checking fence lines in December, avoiding him?" She shot him a sharp look, then laughed, a surprisingly warm sound in the cold room. "You're perceptive, Sheriff. We had words this morning about my future. Let me guess. He wants you married off to some respectable rancher." "Close. He wants me married to Morton Caldwell." Declan couldn't hide his grimace. Morton Caldwell owned the largest ranch in the valley, a spread 3 times the size of the Greenwood place. He was also 57 years old, twice widowed, and known for a temper that kept his ranch hands turning over every few months. "I take it you're not interested," he said carefully. "I'd rather throw myself off a cliff," Sarah said flatly, "but Papa sees it as a good match. Caldwell's rich, established, and he's been making offers for our land for years. Marrying me would be a way to merge the properties without Papa having to admit he needs help running the place." "Does he need help?" Sarah sighed. "He's 63 and he broke his leg badly last spring. It didn't heal right. He won't admit it, but he's in pain most days and he can't do the work he used to. We've got 3 good hands, but it's not enough. We need more help or we need to sell, and Papa would rather die than sell the land Mama loved." Declan understood pride. He'd seen it destroy good men before, seen them cling to losing propositions out of sheer stubbornness until there was nothing left but dust and regret. "So what will you do?" he asked. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. "Run away, maybe. I've got an aunt in Denver who's been begging me to come stay with her, but leaving Papa alone." She shook her head. "I can't do it. For all his faults, he's my father, and without Mama, I'm all he has left." The wind howled louder, and a particularly strong gust made the whole shack shudder. Declan checked the stove and added another piece of wood, conscious of how quickly their supply was dwindling. They'd need to be careful to make it last. "We should try to sleep," he said. "Save our energy. I'll take the floor near the door, you take the spot by the stove where it's warmest." "That's not fair. You came out in the storm to rescue me. You should have the warm spot. I'm used to rough conditions, and I'm wearing more layers than you." They argued back and forth for a few minutes before finally compromising. They'd both sleep near the stove, but maintaining a respectful distance. Sarah fashioned a blanket barrier between them, a symbolic gesture that wouldn't mean much to the gossips, but seemed to make her feel better. Declan lay in the darkness, listening to the storm rage outside and Sarah's breathing gradually slow into sleep. He should have been exhausted, but his mind kept turning over the situation. When they got back to town, assuming they survived the blizzard, there would be talk. Lots of talk. Sarah's reputation would be in tatters unless something was done to prevent it. The solution, when it came to him, was both obvious and terrifying. He could marry her. It made a kind of brutal sense. If they returned to town as man and wife, the scandal would be minimal. People might talk about the rushed nature of it, but a winter wedding wasn't unheard of, and there were enough religious folks in Westcliff who would approve of making an honest woman of her rather than leaving her compromised. But marriage was a permanent solution to a temporary problem. Declan had been alone for so long that the thought of tying himself to another person, especially a woman he barely knew, made his chest tight with something close to panic. And yet, as he lay there in the dark, he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe this was exactly what was supposed to happen. He'd risked his life to save her without a second thought. That had to mean something, didn't it? The storm howled on through the night, and Declan finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, his dreams full of snow and dark green eyes. He woke to find Sarah already up, adding wood to the stove and checking on the horses. Pale gray light filtered through the gaps in the shutters, and the wind had died down to a steady moan rather than a scream. "Is it over?" Declan asked, sitting up and wincing at the stiffness in his back. "Not yet, but it's lighter. We might be able to see 10 feet now instead of 2. Sarah handed him some jerky and a cup of water. Breakfast of champions. They ate in companionable silence. In the growing light, Declan could see that Sarah looked tired but composed, her hair braided neatly back from her face. She'd probably been up for a while, giving him the extra sleep. "Sarah," he started, then stopped. "How did you propose marriage to someone you'd known for less than 24 hours? We need to talk about what happens when we get back to town." Her hand stilled on the cup she was holding. "I know, people will talk. More than talk. Your reputation will be destroyed. No decent man will court you and the women in town will shut you out of their circles. I'm aware of how it works, Sheriff." Her voice had gone cool, defensive. "I have a solution. You're not going to like it." She looked at him warily. "Go on. We get married." The cup slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor, water spilling across the rough boards. "What? Think about it." Declan pressed on, committed now. "If we come back as husband and wife, there's no scandal. We'd need to say we were courting quietly, decided to marry quickly because of the storm. It's not perfect, but it's believable enough." Sarah stared at him like he'd grown a second head. "You want to marry me, a woman you met yesterday, to save my reputation?" "Yes. That's insane, maybe. But it would work." She stood up abruptly, pacing the small space like a caged animal. "You don't even know me, I don't know you. Marriage is supposed to be, it's supposed to mean something." "It does mean something," Declan said quietly. "It means I'm not willing to let your life be ruined because I came out in a blizzard to find you. So this is guilt, obligation." Sarah's eyes flashed with anger. "I won't be anyone's burden, Sheriff. That's not what I meant." Declan stood as well, frustrated by his inability to explain what he was feeling. "Look, I know this isn't romantic. I know it's not what either of us imagined for ourselves. But we're practical people living in a hard world. Sometimes practical solutions are the best we can manage." Sarah stopped pacing and crossed her arms over her chest. "And what kind of marriage would this be? Are you expecting? I mean, would you want?" She couldn't seem to finish the question, color flooding her cheeks. "We'd figure it out as we went," Declan said. "I'm not asking you to fall in love with me, Sarah. I'm asking you to let me protect you the only way I know how. By trapping us both in a loveless marriage." The words stung more than they should have. "Better than the alternative. Or do you want to marry Morton Caldwell after all? Because that's where this is heading if we do nothing." That hit home. Sarah's face went pale and she sank back down onto her makeshift bed. "No, I can't marry him, I won't." "Then marry me instead." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of a decision that would shape the rest of their lives. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault, indifferent to the human drama playing out in the tiny shack. Finally, Sarah looked up at him. "If we do this, I want your word on something, anything. No lies. Whatever this marriage becomes, we're honest with each other, always. I've watched too many couples destroy themselves with secrets and half-truths." Declan nodded slowly. "I can promise that, and we try. Really try to make this work. I won't be trapped in a house with a man who resents me." "I won't resent you. You say that now. But a year from now, 5 years from now, when you meet someone you actually want to marry." He crossed the space between them and knelt down so they were eye to eye. "Sarah Greenwood, I'm 30 years old. I've had plenty of opportunities to marry for love, and I never took them. Maybe this isn't the romance story you dreamed about as a girl, but I swear to you, I will do everything in my power to make you happy. That's the best I can offer." She searched his face for a long moment, those green eyes seeming to look straight through to his soul. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she finally nodded. "All right. Yes, I'll marry you." The words should have felt like a victory, but instead, Declan felt a strange mixture of relief and terror. He just committed himself to a lifetime with a woman he barely knew, all because of a blizzard and a sense of honor that wouldn't let him look away from the consequences of his actions. "We'll need to make it official as soon as we get back to town," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Is there a traveling preacher in the area? Reverend Thomas comes through about once a month, but he was just here last week, so it'll be a while before he's back. Then we'll ride to the nearest town that has a permanent minister. Make it legal and binding before anyone has time to spread stories." Sarah nodded, though she looked as uncertain as he felt. "What do we tell my father?" That was a good question. Thomas Greenwood struck Declan as the kind of man who wouldn't appreciate his daughter being pressured into marriage, even if the alternative was social ruin. "The truth," Declan decided. "Or close to it. We'll say that during the night we talked and realized we had feelings for each other. It's not entirely a lie. I do feel something for you, even if I can't name it yet." "Responsibility," Sarah said with a hint of bitterness. "Obligation. Maybe, but also respect, admiration. You didn't panic when the storm hit. You made it to shelter, got a fire going, took care of yourself. That takes strength." A small smile tugged at her lips. "You're trying to romance me now, Sheriff, Declan. If we're going to be married, you should call me Declan." "Declan," she repeated, testing the name. "All right, and you should call me Sarah, not Miss Greenwood." "Sarah." They sat there for a moment, the formality between them cracking just slightly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The second day in the shack passed slowly. The storm continued unabated, though there were occasional breaks when the snow lightened and they could see a bit further. They talked more, sharing stories of their lives, trying to build some foundation of knowledge about each other that would make the coming marriage feel less like a leap into darkness. Declan learned that Sarah could shoot better than most men, that she'd been helping run the ranch since she was 15, that she loved books but rarely had time to read them. She had strong opinions about everything from politics to horse breeding, and she wasn't afraid to argue when she disagreed with him. Sarah learned that Declan had seen things during the war that still haunted his dreams, that he'd become a lawman because he wanted to bring order to a chaotic world, that he played the harmonica but only when he was alone. He admitted to being stubborn, to having a temper he worked hard to control, to sometimes feeling like he was still drifting even though he'd been in Westcliff for 3 years. As night fell again, they settled into their sleeping arrangements with less awkwardness than before. The blanket barrier remained, but they talked quietly in the darkness, their voices creating an intimacy that felt both dangerous and necessary. "Are you scared?" Sarah asked. "Of the storm? Of getting married?" Declan considered lying, then remembered his promise of honesty. "Terrified." "Me too." "We'll figure it out together," he said, hoping it was true. "Promise me something else," Sarah said softly. "What? If this becomes unbearable, if we try and it doesn't work, you'll let me go?" "No matter what the law says about wives being property of their husbands, you'll give me the freedom to leave." The request cut deeper than he'd expected. She was already planning an escape route, already assuming failure, but he couldn't blame her for that. He'd offered her a practical arrangement, not a love match. "I promise," he said, even though the thought of her leaving already hurt in a way he didn't want to examine. "But I'm going to do everything I can to make sure it doesn't come to that." "I believe you," Sarah whispered. "I don't know why, but I do." The third day dawned clear and brutally cold. The storm had finally blown itself out during the night, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Drifts piled as high as Declan's chest in places, and the entire valley had disappeared under a blanket of pristine white. They packed up the shack carefully, making sure to leave it stocked for the next person who might need emergency shelter. The horses were restless, eager to move after being cooped up for so long. Declan helped Sarah saddle her mare, a pretty chestnut with a white blaze, and they set out toward the Greenwood ranch. The journey that had taken him hours in the storm took just under 2 in the clear morning light. The cold was intense, sharp enough to burn the lungs with each breath, but the sun was bright, and the sky was that particular shade of blue that only seemed to exist in the high mountains. They rode in silence for the most part, each lost in their own thoughts about what waited ahead. As the ranch buildings came into view, Declan saw people moving around in the yard. Thomas Greenwood spotted them first and came running through the snow, his limp pronounced but his face bright with relief. "Sarah, thank God." He pulled his daughter from her horse and wrapped her in a fierce embrace. "I thought I'd lost you, girl. I thought you were gone." "I'm fine, Papa. The sheriff found me at the line shack." Sarah hugged him back, and Declan saw tears on both their faces. Thomas turned to him, still gripping Sarah's shoulders. "Sheriff Xavier, I don't have words to thank you. You risked your life for my daughter. I'm in your debt." "No debt, Mr. Greenwood, just doing my duty." Declan dismounted, his legs stiff from the cold ride. The hell, it was just duty. "You could have died out there." Thomas clapped him on the shoulder hard enough to make him stagger. "Come inside, both of you. Martha's been keeping coffee hot and we've got a fire going." They moved into the house, where Martha Henderson fussed over them with blankets and food. The ranch hands appeared, clearly relieved to see Sarah safe. Everyone was talking at once, asking questions about the storm and the shack and how they'd survived. In the midst of the chaos, Declan caught Sarah's eye. She gave him a small nod and he understood. It was time. "Mr. Greenwood," Declan said, his voice cutting through the chatter. "I need to speak with you privately. It's important." Something in his tone made the room go quiet. Thomas looked between Declan and Sarah, his expression shifting from relief to wariness. "All right. Let's go to my study." Declan followed the older man down a short hallway to a small room that smelled of pipe tobacco and leather. Thomas closed the door and gestured to a chair, but Declan remained standing. "What's this about, Sheriff? I want to marry your daughter." Thomas froze in the act of settling into his own chair. "You want to what? Marry Sarah? With your permission, of course. You just spent 3 days alone with her in a shack, and now you want to marry her." Thomas's voice was rising. "Is this because you compromised her?" "Because if you laid one hand on my daughter, sheriff or not, I didn't touch her," Declan interrupted firmly. "She was a perfect lady and I was a gentleman, but we both know what people will say, what they'll think. Sarah's reputation will be destroyed unless we marry, and quickly. So this is obligation." Thomas's face was turning red. "You're proposing to my daughter out of obligation." "I'm proposing because I respect her, and I won't let her suffer for my decision to come after her in a blizzard." Declan met the older man's eyes steadily. "And because during those 3 days I got to know her. She's smart, capable, strong-minded. I think we could make a good partnership." Partnership. Thomas spat the word like it tasted bitter. "My Sarah deserves better than a partnership. She deserves a man who loves her, who'll cherish her." "With respect, sir, the man you were planning to marry her off to is Morton Caldwell, who's old enough to be her grandfather and mean enough to make her miserable. At least I'm offering her a chance at something better than that." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "She told you about Caldwell. We talked." "About a lot of things." Declan took a breath, trying to find the right words. "Look, Mr. Greenwood, I'm not going to stand here and tell you I'm in love with your daughter. We barely know each other. But I give you my word that I'll treat her with respect, that I'll provide for her, and that I'll do my level best to make her happy. That's more than most women get. It's not enough. Maybe not, but it's honest, and right now it's the best option she has." The two men stared at each other for a long moment. Finally, Thomas sighed and sank into his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 63 years. "Does Sarah agree to this?" he asked quietly. "She does. And you'll take care of her, even if the feeling never grows into love?" "I swear it." Thomas was quiet for a long time, his calloused hands gripping the arms of his chair. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Her mother would have hated this. She always wanted Sarah to have a love match like we did." He looked up at Declan. "But Mary's gone, and I'm not blind to the situation. If you'd left Sarah out there, she'd be dead. If you bring her back unmarried after 3 days alone, she's ruined. You're offering the only solution that keeps her alive and respectable." "Yes, sir." "Then you have my permission." Thomas stood and offered his hand. "But know this, Sheriff. You hurt her, you make her miserable, and I'll come after you. Badge or no badge." Declan shook his hand. "I'd expect nothing less." They returned to the main room where Sarah was waiting with barely concealed anxiety. When she saw both men's faces, some of the tension left her shoulders. "Papa," she asked. "The sheriff has asked for your hand, and I've given my blessing," Thomas said. "If this is what you want, Sarah, then I won't stand in your way." Sarah crossed to her father and kissed his cheek. "Thank you, Papa." Martha Henderson, who'd been pretending not to listen from the kitchen, bustled in with a broad smile. "A wedding? Oh, how wonderful! When are you thinking?" "As soon as possible," Declan said. "We'll need to ride to Canyon City to find a preacher." "I'd like to leave tomorrow if the roads are passable." "Tomorrow?" Martha's eyes widened. "But there's so much to prepare. Sarah needs a proper dress. We need to arrange a celebration. We'll keep it simple," Sarah said firmly. "Just family and close friends." "I don't need a fancy dress or a big party." Martha looked like she wanted to argue, but something in Sarah's expression stopped her. "Well, at least let me help you look presentable. You can't get married in riding clothes." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. While Martha helped Sarah go through her limited wardrobe, Declan rode back to town to arrange for a deputy to cover his duties while he was gone. The news of the impending marriage spread through Westcliff like wildfire, and by the time he returned to the ranch that evening, half the town seemed to know. He found Sarah on the front porch, wrapped in a heavy shawl and staring out at the snow-covered valley. She turned when she heard his footsteps, and he was struck again by how pretty she was, even with worry lines creasing her forehead. Having second thoughts, he asked, joining her at the railing. "About 100 of them," she admitted. "You, at least that many." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the sun set behind the mountains in a blaze of orange and pink. "We're really doing this," Sarah said softly. "We are. I keep thinking I should feel differently, more excited or more scared or something, but mostly I just feel numb." Declan understood that. The magnitude of what they were about to do was too large to fully comprehend. "Maybe that's our minds protecting us. If we thought too hard about it, we'd probably both run for the hills." Sarah laughed, though it sounded a bit shaky. "Promise me something, Declan." "Another promise. We're going to run out of things to promise. Promise me that someday when we look back on this, we won't regret it." He wanted to make that promise, wanted to give her the reassurance she was asking for, but he'd sworn to always be honest with her. "I can't promise we won't have regrets," he said slowly. "But I can promise that whatever happens, we'll face it together. That's got to count for something." Sarah nodded, blinking rapidly. "Together, all right. I can work with that." They left for Canyon City the next morning, riding out at dawn with Thomas accompanying them as witness and guardian of propriety. The 40-mile journey took most of the day, the horses struggling through deep snow in places. But the main roads had been cleared enough to make passage possible, and they arrived at the small city as the sun was setting. Canyon City was bigger than Westcliff, with actual streets and storefronts and a proper church with a full-time minister. Reverend Samuel Harding was a kindly man in his 50s who didn't ask too many questions when Declan explained their need for a quick wedding. He'd seen enough frontier couples in unusual circumstances to know that sometimes love worked on its own timeline. "We can do the ceremony tomorrow afternoon," Reverend Harding said. "That'll give me time to draw up the proper papers and give you young folks a chance to rest from your journey." They took rooms at the local boarding house, Declan in one and Sarah in another with her father between them like a protective wall. That night, lying in an unfamiliar bed and listening to the sounds of the city outside his window, Declan had plenty of time to question every decision that had led him to this point. He was about to marry a woman he'd known for less than a week. A woman who was only agreeing to this out of necessity, not love. A woman who might very well end up hating him for trapping her in this arrangement. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah's face in the firelight of the lined shack, the way she'd looked at him when she'd said yes, the mixture of fear and determination in her eyes. She was brave, braver than he deserved. The least he could do was try to be worthy of the trust she was placing in him. The next day passed in a strange fog. Declan bought a new shirt and had his boots polished. Sarah, with Martha Henderson's help via borrowed clothes from the boarding house owner, found a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes. They stood in the church at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Thomas on Sarah's side and the boarding house owner acting as a witness for Declan, and spoke vows that would bind them together for the rest of their lives. "Do you, Declan James Xavier, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do." His voice was steady, even though his heart was pounding. "And do you, Sarah Jane Greenwood, Take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part." Sarah's eyes met his, and for a moment he saw every doubt and fear reflected there. Then she squared her shoulders and spoke clearly. "I do." But as Reverend Harding was about to pronounce them man and wife, Declan held up a hand. "Wait, please, just one moment." Everyone looked at him in surprise. Sarah's face went pale, probably thinking he was about to back out. Instead, Declan turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Sarah, I know we're standing here because of a blizzard and bad luck and the unfair way the world treats women. I know this isn't the wedding you dreamed of or the marriage you wanted. But I need you to know something before we finish these vows." He took a breath, the words coming from somewhere deep inside, somewhere he hadn't known existed until this moment. "This vow I make by choice," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Not because I have to, not because of obligation or guilt or what people will say. I choose to marry you, Sarah Greenwood. I choose to stand by your side and build a life with you. And I swear that I will spend every day trying to make that choice mean something." Tears were streaming down Sarah's face now, and he saw Thomas pull out a handkerchief and blow his nose loudly. Even Reverend Harding looked a bit misty-eyed. "I choose this too," Sarah whispered. "I choose you, Declan Xavier, and I swear I'll try to make you glad you took a chance on me." The Reverend cleared his throat and smiled. "Well then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Young man, you may kiss your bride." Declan had been so focused on the vows that he'd almost forgotten about this part. He leaned in carefully, intending just a brief, respectful kiss. But when his lips met Sarah's, something unexpected happened. A spark of something real and electric passed between them, a promise of what might be possible if they were brave enough to reach for it. When they pulled apart, Sarah's eyes were wide with surprise that probably matched his own. "Well," she said softly, just for him, "that was unexpected." "Yeah," he agreed. "It was." They signed the papers in a daze, making it official and legal. Sarah Greenwood became Sarah Xavier with a few strokes of a pen, and Declan found himself with a wife he was already starting to care for more than was probably wise. Thomas insisted on buying them dinner at the nicest restaurant in Canyon City, a small place that served surprisingly good steaks and had candles on the tables. The conversation was stilted at first, the weight of what had just happened making everyone a bit awkward. But gradually they relaxed, and by the time dessert arrived, they were actually laughing at one of Thomas's stories about Sarah as a wild child. She was 8 years old, and convinced she could ride any horse on the ranch, Thomas said, his eyes fond. "Picked the meanest gelding we had, a big black devil named Thunder. He threw her 7 times before she finally gave up." "I didn't give up," Sarah protested. "I just decided to wait until I was bigger." "Did you ever ride him?" Declan asked. "When I was 14. Rode him every day for a month until he figured out I was more stubborn than he was." She grinned. "Papa sold him the next year to a man who couldn't believe how gentle he'd become." "Because you'd broken his spirit," Thomas said, but he was smiling. "I prefer to think I'd taught him manners." Declan found himself relaxing into the easy banter, enjoying the glimpse into Sarah's childhood. She'd been a force of nature, even as a girl, apparently, and that fierce determination had only grown stronger with age. As the evening wound down, Thomas excused himself to his room, leaving Declan and Sarah alone at the table. The moment stretched between them, suddenly awkward again. "I suppose we should talk about sleeping arrangements," Sarah said, not quite meeting his eyes. "I can take the floor in your room," Declan offered. Or we can get separate rooms if that would make you more comfortable. We're married now. People would think it's strange if we weren't sharing a room." Sarah twisted her new wedding ring on her finger, a simple gold band they'd purchased that afternoon. "But I'm not. I mean, I know that husbands and wives usually." "I'm not expecting anything," Declan said firmly. "We agreed to figure this out as we go. That includes all of it." Relief flooded her face. "Thank you." They made their way upstairs to what was now their shared room. The boarding house owner had gone to the trouble of putting fresh flowers on the dresser and the best linens on the bed, clearly trying to make it romantic for the newlyweds. Declan did his best not to think about the fact that there was only one bed. "I'll step out while you change," he said. "Just let me know when you're ready." Sarah nodded gratefully. He waited in the hallway for what felt like an eternity before she called him back in. She was wearing a long nightgown that covered her from neck to toes, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked young and vulnerable and beautiful, and Declan had to remind himself sternly of his promise. "I'll sleep on top of the covers," he said. "You take the bed properly." "Declan, that's ridiculous. It's freezing. You'll catch your death." Sarah bit her lip. "We can share the bed like adults. I trust you to keep your word." So they arranged themselves carefully on opposite sides of the mattress, a careful distance maintained between them. Declan blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. "Declan?" Sarah's voice came soft through the dark. "Yeah, thank you. For what you said during the ceremony about making the vow by choice. I meant it. I know, that's what made it so powerful." She was quiet for a moment. "I hope someday I can make you glad you chose me." "Sarah, I'm already glad. You're probably the bravest person I've ever met. Brave or just desperate, definitely brave." He rolled onto his side, though he couldn't see her in the darkness. "Try to get some sleep. We've got a long ride back tomorrow." "Good night, husband." The words sent a strange thrill through him. "Good night, wife." He lay awake long after her breathing had evened out into sleep, wondering what he'd gotten himself into and whether he'd have the strength to see it through. But beneath the fear and uncertainty, there was something else. Something that felt almost like hope. The ride back to Westcliff took 2 days with an overnight stop at a small way station. Thomas had decided to ride ahead to prepare the ranch for Sarah's return, leaving the newlyweds to travel alone. It should have been awkward, but instead it felt oddly comfortable. They talked easily about everything and nothing, and when they stopped to rest the horses, Declan found himself looking for excuses to make her laugh. The town gave them a small celebration when they arrived, despite Sarah's protests that it wasn't necessary. Someone had strung up ribbons outside the sheriff's office, and a group of ladies had organized a potluck supper at the church. Declan saw plenty of curious looks, and new people were counting backwards in their heads, trying to figure out if a baby would arrive suspiciously early. But for the most part, folks seemed genuinely happy for them. Morton Caldwell was conspicuously absent. "He's not taking it well," Martha Henderson confided to Sarah when she thought Declan wasn't listening. "He'd already started making plans to merge the ranches. Lost his temper something fierce when he heard you'd married the sheriff instead." Declan filed that information away. Caldwell was a powerful man in the valley, and powerful men didn't like being thwarted. He'd need to keep an eye on the situation. The question of where they'd live was solved by Thomas, who insisted they take over the foreman's cabin on the Greenwood ranch. The previous foreman had moved on months ago, and the small 2-room cabin had been sitting empty ever since. "It needs work," Thomas admitted as he showed them the place. "But it's sturdy and it's got a good stove. You can fix it up however you like." The cabin was indeed rough, with a leaking roof and gaps in the chinking that let in cold air. But it had potential. The main room was a decent size, with space for a kitchen area and a sitting room. The bedroom was smaller but cozy, with a real bed frame and a window that looked out toward the mountains. "We can make this work," Sarah said, already mentally rearranging furniture. They spent the next 2 weeks turning the cabin into a home. Declan fixed the roof and re-chinked the walls while Sarah scrubbed every surface and hung curtains she'd sewn from fabric Martha donated. They worked well together, Declan discovered. Sarah wasn't afraid of hard work, and she had strong opinions about how things should be done, but she was willing to compromise when he had a better idea. Slowly, carefully, they built a life together. Declan continued his work as sheriff, riding into town most days to handle whatever minor crimes and disputes arose in the small community. Sarah helped her father run the ranch, managing the books and overseeing the ranch hands. In the evenings, they'd return to the cabin and share a simple meal, talking about their days. The sleeping arrangements remained chaste, both of them on their respective sides of the bed. But Declan found himself increasingly aware of Sarah's presence, the way she hummed while she cooked, the way she read by lamplight with her legs tucked under her, the way she smiled at him when he said something that amused her. He realized with some surprise, starting to fall for his wife. The revelation came about 6 weeks into their marriage. He'd been called out to handle a dispute between 2 ranchers over water rights, a tedious affair that had taken most of the day. He was tired and frustrated when he finally rode up to the cabin that evening, ready for nothing more than food and bed. But when he opened the door, he was greeted by warmth and the smell of something wonderful cooking. Sarah had made a roast with potatoes and carrots, a rare treat since meat was expensive and they were trying to save money. The table was set with their mismatched dishes, and she'd even found some wildflowers to put in a jar as a centerpiece. "What's the occasion?" he asked, hanging up his coat. "No occasion. I just wanted to do something nice." She smiled at him and something in his chest twisted. "How was your day?" As they ate dinner and talked about water rights and ranch management, Declan found himself watching her hands as she gestured, the way the lamplight caught in her hair, the intelligence in her eyes when she was working through a problem. She was fascinating and frustrating and funny, and somewhere along the way she'd become essential to his happiness. He was falling in love with her, and he had no idea if she felt the same way. That night, after Sarah had gone to bed, Declan sat at the table and tried to figure out what to do. He'd promised her honesty, which meant he should probably tell her how he was feeling. But what if she didn't feel the same? What if she was content with their friendly partnership and had no interest in anything deeper? He could ruin everything by pushing for more. In the end, he decided to wait. To let things develop naturally, and hope that she might come to care for him the way he cared for her. The decision became harder to stick to as spring arrived, and the snow began to melt. There was something about the changing season that made everything feel new and possible. They spent more time outside, working together to plant a garden and repair fences. Sarah laughed more easily, and Declan caught her watching him sometimes with an expression he couldn't quite read. One warm evening in early May, they were sitting on the porch watching the sunset when Sarah suddenly spoke. "Declan, can I ask you something? Anything? Do you ever regret marrying me?" The question caught him off guard. "What? No, never. Why would you ask that?" Sarah twisted her hands together, not looking at him. "Because I've been thinking about our wedding day, about what you said about making the vow by choice, and I realized I never properly thanked you for that, for making me feel like I wasn't just a burden you'd taken on. Sarah, look at me." He waited until she met his eyes. "You are not a burden. You have never been a burden. These past few months have been. They've been the happiest of my life." "Really?" Hope flickered in her expression. "Really?" He took a breath, knowing he was about to step off a cliff. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. I know we agreed to take this slow, to figure things out as we went. But I can't keep pretending that this is just a practical arrangement for me anymore." Her eyes widened. "What do you mean?" "I mean I'm falling in love with you. Maybe I have been since that first night in the line shack. I don't know. But every day it gets stronger and I can't hide it anymore." The words tumbled out in a rush. "I understand if you don't feel the same way. I know this wasn't what you signed up for. But I promised you honesty, and that's the truth." For a long moment, Sarah just stared at him. Then slowly a smile spread across her face. "You idiot," she said, but her voice was warm. "I've been falling in love with you too. I thought I was the only one." Relief and joy flooded through him in equal measure. "You have, since you fixed the leak in the roof and fell through the ceiling into a pile of insulation." She laughed at the memory. "You were covered in dust and swearing a blue streak, and all I could think was that I wanted to kiss you." "Why didn't you?" "Because I was scared. What if I'd misread everything? What if you were just being kind because you felt obligated?" She reached out and took his hand. "But if you're saying what I think you're saying, I love you, Sarah Xavier. Not because I have to, but because I can't help it. I love you too, Declan. So much it scares me sometimes." He pulled her close and kissed her properly this time, not the chaste peck from their wedding, but a real kiss that held all the longing and hope of the past few months. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "So," Sarah said, a bit breathlessly, "I suppose this changes things." "I suppose it does." That night, their marriage became a true marriage in every sense. And if Declan had thought he was happy before, it was nothing compared to the joy of being with someone he loved who loved him back just as fiercely. The next few months passed in a golden haze of happiness. They were still poor, still working hard to make ends meet, but none of that mattered when they had each other. Declan found himself whistling as he made his rounds through town, and Sarah's laughter rang out across the ranch more days than not. Thomas Greenwood, watching his daughter bloom, admitted to Declan one evening that maybe the marriage hadn't been such a bad idea after all. "I was wrong about you, Sheriff," Thomas said gruffly. "You've made her happier than I ever could have. Thank you for that." "I'm the lucky one," Declan replied honestly. "Not everything was perfect, of course. There were arguments about money and whose turn it was to do the dishes." Sarah's independence sometimes clashed with Declan's protective instincts, leading to some spectacular fights that usually ended with them laughing at how ridiculous they were being. But they worked through each conflict together, learning each other's patterns and preferences, building the foundation of a partnership that went deeper than either of them had expected. The trouble with Morton Caldwell came to a head in late summer. Declan had been hearing rumors for weeks about Caldwell trying to buy up land in the valley, making offers to struggling ranchers that were just barely generous enough to be accepted. The man was building an empire, and he didn't appreciate the Greenwood ranch standing in his way. The confrontation happened in town, on a hot August afternoon when Declan was dealing with a drunk cowboy who decided to shoot out the windows of the saloon. He'd just gotten the man into a cell when Caldwell walked into his office, his face red with anger. "Sheriff Xavier, we need to talk." Declan closed the cell door and turned to face him. "What can I do for you, Mr. Caldwell? You can tell your wife to stop interfering with my business dealings." "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about. Don't play stupid with me." Caldwell slapped a piece of paper on Declan's desk. "Sarah's been visiting every rancher I've made an offer to, telling them not to sell. She's costing me money and opportunity." Declan picked up the paper. It was a list of names, ranchers he recognized from around the valley. "Sarah's allowed to talk to whoever she wants. It's a free country. She's poisoning them against me, spreading lies about how I do business." Are they lies? Declan asked mildly. Caldwell's face went even redder. You watch yourself, Sheriff. I have friends in Denver, important people. One word from me and you'll lose that badge. Threaten me all you want, Caldwell, but you don't get to tell my wife what she can and can't say. Declan stood up, using his height to full advantage. Now, if there's nothing else, I have actual sheriff work to do. For a moment it looked like Caldwell might take a swing at him. Then the older man stepped back, his expression cold. This isn't over, he said. I expect not. After Caldwell left, Declan sat down heavily at his desk. He'd made an enemy today, a powerful one. But he couldn't regret standing up for Sarah, even if it cost him his job. When he got home that evening, he found Sarah in the garden, pulling weeds. She looked up as he approached, her expression guilty. You heard about Caldwell, she said. He came to my office, made some threats. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cause you trouble. She stood up, brushing dirt from her hands. But Declan, the offers he's making are terrible. These people are desperate and he's taking advantage. The Mitchell family has been on their land for 20 years. Caldwell's offering them half what it's worth. I'm not angry, Declan assured her. I'm proud of you for standing up for what's right. I just wanted to warn you that Caldwell's not going to take this lying down. Let him try something. We'll face it together. And they did. When Caldwell attempted to have Declan removed from office on trumped-up charges of misconduct, Sarah rallied the townspeople to his defense. When he tried to spread rumors about Sarah being an unfit wife, Declan made sure everyone in town knew exactly what kind of man Caldwell was. The final confrontation came in early September. Caldwell, frustrated by his inability to intimidate or outmaneuver them, made one last desperate play. He rode to the Greenwood ranch with a group of hired guns and demanded that Thomas sell the land or face the consequences. He hadn't counted on Thomas being a stubborn old rancher who'd fought in the Mexican War, or on his daughter being a crack shot with a rifle, or on his son-in-law being a lawman who took his oath seriously. Declan arrived at the ranch to find Sarah and her father standing on the porch, both armed, facing down Caldwell and 6 men on horseback. That's far enough, Thomas was saying. This is private property and you're trespassing. I'm making you a final offer, Greenwood. $50,000 for the whole spread. Take it or I'll make sure you regret it. The only one who's going to have regrets is you if you don't turn around and leave, Sarah said, her rifle steady in her hands. Caldwell's face twisted with rage. You think you can threaten me, girl? I'll destroy you. I'll destroy your whole family. That's when Declan stepped into view, his own rifle in hand and his badge clearly visible on his chest. Morton Caldwell, you're under arrest for trespassing, intimidation, and attempted extortion, he said calmly. Your men can leave now or they can join you in jail. Your choice. The hired guns looked at each other uncertainly. They'd been paid to intimidate, not to tangle with the law. One by one, they turned their horses and rode away, leaving Caldwell alone and furious. You can't arrest me, Caldwell sputtered. I have rights. I'll have your badge for this. You can try. Declan moved closer, his rifle never wavering. Now are you going to come quietly, or do I need to hogtie you and throw you over your horse? Caldwell came quietly, though he cursed the entire ride back to town. Declan locked him up and sent a telegram to the territorial marshal explaining the situation. It would be up to the courts to decide Caldwell's ultimate fate, but at the very least, he'd be spending some time behind bars. When Declan finally made it back to the ranch that night, exhausted and still running on adrenaline, he found Sarah waiting on the porch. She flew into his arms the moment he dismounted. Are you all right? She asked, her voice muffled against his chest. I'm fine. How's your father? celebrating with a glass of whiskey and boring the ranch hands with war stories. She pulled back to look at him. You could have been killed today. So could you? Don't think I didn't notice you facing down 6 armed men with nothing but a rifle and stubbornness. We're quite a pair, aren't we? Sarah smiled, though her eyes were suspiciously bright. Promise me something, Declan. Haven't we made enough promises? Promise me that no matter what else happens, we'll always stand together like we did today. You and me against the world. He kissed her forehead, her nose, her lips. That's the easiest promise I've ever made. You're stuck with me, Sarah Xavier, for better or worse. I'm counting on it. The scandal of Caldwell's arrest rocked the valley for weeks. The territorial marshal, after investigating the charges, found enough evidence of corruption and illegal business practices to keep Caldwell tied up in legal troubles for years. His empire began to crumble as the people he'd victimized came forward with their own stories. For Declan and Sarah, life gradually returned to normal. They continued their work, building their life together one day at a time. Sarah's influence on the ranch grew as Thomas increasingly relied on her judgment, and Declan earned a reputation as a fair but firm lawman who couldn't be bought or intimidated. On a cold November evening, almost a year after that fateful blizzard, Sarah told Declan she was pregnant. They were sitting by the fire in their cabin, the first real snow of the season falling softly outside. Sarah had been quiet all through dinner, and Declan had been about to ask what was wrong when she suddenly spoke. I saw the doctor in town today. His heart clenched with worry. Are you sick? What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. I'm going to have a baby. We're going to have a baby. For a moment, Declan couldn't speak. Joy and fear and wonder crashed over him in waves. A baby. Their baby. Are you sure? He finally managed. The doctor is sure. He says the baby should come sometime in early June. Sarah was watching his face anxiously. Are you happy? I know we never really talked about children. Happy? Declan pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. Sarah, I'm terrified and thrilled and so happy I could burst. A baby. We're going to be parents. She laughed, the sound full of relief and joy. We are. Can you believe it? Honestly, no, but I can't wait. They spent the rest of the evening making plans and dreaming about the future. They'd need to add on to the cabin, make room for a nursery. Sarah would need to cut back on some of her heavier ranch work. They'd have to think about names, about how to raise a child in this harsh but beautiful place. Boy or girl, it doesn't matter to me, Declan said as they lay in bed that night, his hand resting on Sarah's stomach. As long as they're healthy and they have your courage and intelligence. And your kindness and sense of honor, Sarah added. They'll be lucky to have you as a father, Declan. I hope I can live up to that. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the winter months. Sarah bloomed with health, her energy seemingly endless despite the growing life inside her. She continued working on the ranch, though Declan and Thomas both fussed over her constantly, making her rest more than she wanted to. I'm pregnant, not dying, she'd protest when they tried to stop her from lifting things or riding out to check the herds. Humor me, Declan would say, and she'd roll her eyes but comply, because she knew how much it meant to him. They built the nursery addition in early spring, a small room attached to their bedroom with a window that faced east to catch the morning sun. Sarah sewed curtains and blankets, while Declan built a cradle from pine wood, sanding it smooth and carving their initials into the headboard along with the date. Thomas was beside himself with excitement about becoming a grandfather. He'd softened considerably over the past year, the lines of grief and worry that had marked his face after his wife's death fading as he watched his daughter build a happy life. Mary would have loved this, he told Sarah one evening when he thought Declan wasn't listening. "She always wanted grandbabies to spoil. I'm just sorry she isn't here to see it." "Me too, Papa," Sarah said softly. "But I think she knows. Somehow I think she knows." The baby came on a warm June evening, 2 weeks earlier than expected. Declan had been in town dealing with a dispute over a horse sale when one of the ranch hands came galloping in, shouting that Sarah's time had come. He'd never ridden so fast in his life. By the time he reached the ranch, Martha Henderson was already there, along with the doctor from town. Thomas met him at the door, his face pale. "She's asking for you," was all he said. Declan took the stairs 2 at a time and burst into their bedroom. Sarah was propped up on pillows, her face flushed and her hair damp with sweat. But when she saw him, she smiled. "You made it," she said, reaching for his hand. "Wild horses couldn't have kept me away." He knelt beside the bed, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "How are you doing?" "Been better," she admitted as another contraction hit. Her grip on his hand tightened painfully. "But the doctor says everything is progressing normally." The next few hours were the longest of Declan's life. He stayed by Sarah's side through all of it, letting her squeeze his hand until he thought the bones might break, wiping her face with a cool cloth, whispering encouragement and love. Finally, as the sun was setting and painting the room in shades of gold and orange, their baby entered the world with a loud, indignant cry. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, wrapping the tiny, squirming bundle in a blanket. "A healthy baby boy." Declan felt tears streaming down his face as the doctor placed his son in Sarah's arms. She was crying too, gazing down at the baby with such love that it made Declan's chest ache. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We've been waiting for you." The baby had dark hair like Sarah and what looked like it might be Declan's blue eyes, though the doctor said it was too early to tell for sure. He was perfect, from his tiny fingers to his button nose to the way he quieted immediately when Sarah held him close. "What should we name him?" Sarah asked, looking up at Declan. They'd discussed names for months but had never quite settled on one. Now, looking at his son's face, Declan knew exactly what felt right. "James," he said. "After my father. James Thomas Xavier, if that's all right with you, to honor your father too." Sarah's eyes filled with fresh tears. "It's perfect. Welcome to the world, James Thomas Xavier." Thomas was summoned to meet his grandson, and the tough old rancher broke down completely when Sarah placed the baby in his arms. "He looks just like you did," he told Sarah, his voice choked with emotion. "Same serious little face, same stubborn chin. Lord help us all." The first few weeks with baby James were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. He had healthy lungs and no qualms about using them, especially at 3 in the morning. Declan and Sarah took turns walking him around the cabin, singing off key lullabies and promising him that yes, the sun would come up eventually, but there were also moments of perfect peace. Times when Declan would wake in the early morning to find Sarah nursing James, the two of them bathed in soft light, and he'd think his heart might burst from the sheer joy of it. This was his family, his wife and his son. Something he'd never thought he'd have, all because of a blizzard and a choice made in a freezing-lined shack. As summer turned to fall, and James grew from a newborn into an alert, curious baby, Declan found himself reflecting on the strange path that had brought him here. If he'd stayed in his office that December day, if he'd waited for the storm to pass, if he'd never ridden out to find Sarah, his life would be completely different. "You ever think about how easily this all could have never happened?" he asked Sarah one evening. They were sitting on the porch, watching James discover the wonder of falling leaves while Thomas supervised from his rocking chair. "All the time," Sarah admitted. "Sometimes I wonder if maybe there's a reason things worked out the way they did, like it was always supposed to be this way. You think fate brought us together, maybe, or maybe we just got really lucky. She leaned against his shoulder. Does it matter which it is? I suppose not. Declan kissed the top of her head. I'm just grateful, whatever the reason. Life continued its steady rhythm through the fall and into another winter. James took his first steps just after his first birthday, using the coffee table to pull himself up, and then launching himself toward Sarah with more enthusiasm than coordination. He had his mother's fearlessness and his father's stubbornness, a combination that led to plenty of bumps and bruises, but also to a child who was endlessly curious about the world around him. Thomas's health, which had been declining gradually, took a turn for the worse that second winter. He developed a persistent cough that the doctor said was likely pneumonia, and despite everyone's best efforts, he continued to weaken. On a cold February morning, Thomas Greenwood passed away peacefully in his sleep, leaving behind a ranch, a devoted daughter, and a grandson who would never really remember him but would grow up hearing stories about his stubborn, loving grandfather. They buried him next to his wife on a hill overlooking the valley he'd loved. Sarah stood between Declan and Martha Henderson, holding James and crying silent tears, while the Reverend spoke words of comfort that didn't really help. That night, after James was asleep and the last of the visitors had left, Sarah finally broke down completely in Declan's arms. "He was all I had left of my old life," she sobbed. "Mama and now Papa, they're both gone. I know, sweetheart, I know." Declan held her tight, wishing he could take away her pain. "But they gave you so much. Your father's strength, your mother's kindness. They live on in you and now in James. It's not enough. I wanted him to see James grow up. I wanted my son to know his grandfather. James will know him through your stories, through the ranch Thomas built and the values he taught you. That's a legacy worth having." Sarah cried herself to sleep that night, and Declan lay awake beside her, grieving for the man who'd given him a chance when he could have said no to the marriage. Thomas had trusted him with his daughter, his ranch, his legacy. The least Declan could do was honor that trust by taking care of what Thomas had left behind. The ranch became theirs by default, since Sarah was Thomas's only heir. It was both a blessing and a burden. They now had land and resources they'd never had before, but also the responsibility of running a major operation. Declan couldn't do it alone while also serving as sheriff, and Sarah had her hands full with a toddler and the household. They made the decision together. Declan would step down as sheriff and focus on the ranch. It wasn't an easy choice. He'd loved being a lawman, loved the sense of purpose it gave him. But his family came first, and the ranch was James's inheritance. He needed to make sure it thrived. The town gave him a send-off party, and the territorial governor appointed a new sheriff, a young man from Denver named Robert Mills, who seemed capable if a bit green. Declan spent 2 weeks training him, showing him the quirks of the town and the valley, introducing him to the key people he'd need to know. "You're sure about this?" Mills asked on Declan's last day. "You're good at this job, the people respect you." "I'm sure," Declan said. "I've got a different job now, one that's just as important." He hung up his badge and walked out of the office without looking back. It was time to start the next chapter. Running the ranch turned out to be even harder than Declan had anticipated. He'd grown up on a farm, but ranching in the Colorado mountains was a different beast entirely. The weather was brutal and unpredictable, the terrain was unforgiving, and there were always 100 things that could go wrong and frequently did. But he learned. He learned from the ranch hands who'd been there for years, from Sarah who'd grown up knowing this life, from trial and error and sheer determination. He learned to read the weather and the land, to know when to move the cattle and when to let them be, to fix everything from broken fences to injured animals. Sarah proved invaluable, her knowledge of the ranch's operations and her head for numbers keeping them afloat when times got tough. They made a good team, balancing each other's strengths and weaknesses, making decisions together. James grew from a toddler into a bright, energetic boy who loved following his father around the ranch and helping with the chores. By the time he was 4, he could sit a horse reasonably well and was learning to rope fence posts with a lariat Declan had made specially for his small hands. "He's going to be a natural," Sarah said proudly, watching James practice in the yard. "Just like his mother," Declan agreed. Life wasn't perfect. There were hard years when the cattle prices dropped or the weather turned against them. There were arguments about money and priorities, times when the stress of keeping the ranch running drove them both to the edge of their patience. But they always came back to each other, always remembered that they were on the same side. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Declan took Sarah up to the old line shack where they'd spent that fateful blizzard. He'd ridden out earlier in the week to clean it up and stock it with supplies, and he'd convinced Martha to watch James for the night. "Where are we going?" Sarah asked as they rode east from the ranch. "You'll see." When the shack came into view, Sarah laughed with delight. "I can't believe you remembered. How could I forget? This is where everything started." Inside, Declan had set up a simple but romantic scene. Candles, a bottle of wine he'd bought in town, and a picnic dinner Martha had helped him prepare. They ate and talked and watched the sunset through the door, just like they had 5 years ago. "You ever regret it?" Declan asked. "Marrying me, I mean. You could have left after your father died, sold the ranch, moved to Denver, started over, and left you." Sarah looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Declan Xavier, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. That blizzard was the luckiest day of my life." "Mine too." He pulled out a small box he'd been carrying in his pocket. "I got you something." Inside was a silver locket on a delicate chain. Sarah opened it to find 2 tiny photographs inside, one of Declan and one of James. "So you'll always have us close to your heart," Declan said, suddenly feeling foolish. "I know it's not much. It's perfect." Sarah fastened the locket around her neck, tears shining in her eyes. "I love you so much. Sometimes I still can't believe this is real, that we're real. We're real." He kissed her softly. "This vow I make by choice, remember? I choose you every single day, Sarah, and I always will." They made love in the shack where they'd first become husband and wife, and when they rode home the next morning, Sarah was already certain she was pregnant again. She was right. Their second child, a daughter they named Mary Rose after Sarah's mother, and because Declan insisted she was as beautiful as a rose, was born the following spring. Where James had been a loud, demanding baby, Rose was quiet and observant, studying the world with serious dark eyes that seemed too wise for an infant. James, now 5, was fascinated by his baby sister and insisted on helping with everything from changing her clothes to feeding her mashed vegetables. He appointed himself her protector, a role he took very seriously. "Nobody's going to hurt her," he declared solemnly. "I'll take care of her." "I know you will," Declan said, ruffling his son's hair. "You're a good big brother." The years rolled by, each one bringing its own joys and challenges. James started school in Westcliff, riding in with Declan several times a week and staying with Martha Henderson when the weather was bad. Rose grew from a quiet baby into an equally quiet but determined little girl who preferred books to dolls and could calculate sums in her head faster than most adults. When James was 10 and Rose was 5, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. This one was a surprise, neither planned nor expected, but welcomed nonetheless. Their third child, A boy they named Samuel after Reverend Harding, who'd married them all those years ago, arrived in the midst of a spring storm that reminded them both of their beginning. "Another blizzard baby," Sarah laughed as the doctor handed her the squirming infant. "We do seem to have a pattern." Samuel was a perfect blend of his siblings, as loud and energetic as James, but with Rose's thoughtful nature. He completed their family in a way neither Declan nor Sarah had known was missing. The ranch prospered under their careful management. They'd expanded the herd, improved the breeding stock, and built a reputation for quality cattle that commanded premium prices. They weren't rich by any means, but they were comfortable, and they'd built something they could be proud of. Morton Caldwell's empire had completely collapsed by then, the man himself dying in a Denver prison while serving time for fraud and attempted murder, related to a business deal gone wrong. His land was sold off piece by piece, much of it to the very ranchers he'd tried to cheat. "I don't wish death on anyone," Sarah said when they heard the news, "but I can't say I'm sorry he can't hurt anyone else." "Your mother would have said something about reaping what you sow," Declan replied. "She would have. She also would have told me to pray for his soul." Sarah sighed. "I'm trying, but it's hard." One evening when James was 15, Rose was 10, and Samuel was 5, the whole family gathered on the porch to watch a spectacular sunset. The mountains were painted in shades of purple and gold, and the valley spread out before them in a patchwork of greens and browns. "Tell us the story again, Pa," James asked, "about how you and Ma met." It had become a family tradition, the story of the blizzard and the lined shack, and the marriage born of necessity that had turned into love. Declan had told it dozens of times, but he never tired of it. "Well," he started, "it was a December day in 1881, and I got a telegram that would change my life forever." As he told the story, Sarah's hand found his and squeezed gently. Their children listened with rapt attention, even though they'd heard it all before. When he got to the part about the wedding vows, about how he'd stopped the ceremony to tell Sarah he was making the vow by choice, Rose sighed dramatically. "That's so romantic," she said. "That's so weird," James countered. "Who stops their own wedding?" "Someone who wants to make sure his bride knows she's chosen, not just convenient," Sarah said firmly. "Your father is a romantic, even if he pretends not to be." "I don't pretend anything," Declan protested. "You built me a gazebo for our 10th anniversary. That was practical. You needed somewhere shaded to sit in the garden. You carved our initials and wedding date into every post." James and Samuel groaned while Rose giggled. Declan couldn't help but smile. "All right, maybe I'm a little romantic," he admitted. As darkness fell and the children gradually drifted inside, leaving Declan and Sarah alone under the stars, she leaned her head on his shoulder. 20 years, she said softly. "Can you believe it's been 20 years since that blizzard? Best 20 years of my life. Even the hard parts." "Especially the hard parts. We faced them together, didn't we?" Sarah tilted her face up for a kiss. "Together. Always together." "This vow I make by choice," Declan whispered against her lips, repeating the words that had become their private promise to each other. "And this vow I make by love," Sarah replied, completing the ritual they'd developed over the years. They sat together in the peaceful evening, watching the lights come on in the house where their children were probably arguing about whose turn it was to wash dishes. The ranch was quiet around them, the cattle settled for the night, the horses dozing in the barn. This was the life they'd built from a forced marriage in a blizzard. This was what happened when two people chose to honor their vows, to work through the hard times, to love each other even when it wasn't easy. The years continued to pass, bringing more changes and challenges. James grew into a fine young man who decided he wanted to study law in Denver, much to Declan's surprise. Rose discovered a gift for teaching and took a position at the Westcliff School. Samuel, true to his nature, split his time between helping run the ranch and pursuing his passion for breeding horses. Declan and Sarah grew older together, their hair turning gray and their bodies accumulating the aches and pains of a life lived fully. But their love never diminished. If anything, it grew deeper and stronger with each passing year, until they could finish each other's sentences and communicate with just a look. On their 30th anniversary, their children threw them a party that half the county attended. People came from as far as Denver to celebrate the couple who'd become something of a legend in the valley. The sheriff who'd ridden into a blizzard and the rancher's daughter who'd captured his heart. The marriage that shouldn't have worked but became an inspiration to everyone who knew them. "Speech," someone called out, and the crowd took up the chant until Declan reluctantly stood up. "I'm not much for speeches," he started, and people laughed because it was true. "But I do want to say something about the woman sitting next to me." He looked down at Sarah, who was watching him with those same sharp green eyes that had captivated him 3 decades ago. 30 years ago, I rode out in a storm to rescue a stranger. What I found was so much more than I ever expected. Sarah gave me a family, a home, a purpose beyond the badge I wore. She made me a better man than I ever thought I could be. His voice grew thick with emotion. People always talk about that blizzard like it was some kind of miracle, and maybe it was, but the real miracle was what came after. The choice we made to build something together, to love each other through everything life threw at us. He reached down and took Sarah's hand, pulling her up to stand beside him. "This vow I make by choice," he said, repeating the words he'd spoken on their wedding day. 30 years ago and every day since. I choose you, Sarah Xavier. I always have and I always will. There wasn't a dry eye in the house as Sarah threw her arms around him and kissed him soundly to thunderous applause. "And I choose you," she said when they finally broke apart. "My stubborn, romantic, impossible cowboy. Forever." The party went on late into the night, with music and dancing and enough food to feed a small army. Declan watched his children laughing with their friends, watched his grandchildren, the products of James's happy marriage to a teacher from Denver, running around and causing cheerful chaos. He saw the ranch hands he'd worked alongside for years, the neighbors who'd become friends, the community they'd helped build. This was his legacy. Not the land or the cattle or even the ranch itself, but the love that had started in a blizzard and grown to touch so many lives. As the stars came out and the party finally began to wind down, Declan and Sarah slipped away to the porch of their cabin. It was the same cabin they'd fixed up 30 years ago, though it had been expanded and improved countless times since. "Tired?" Declan asked, wrapping his arm around Sarah's waist, exhausted, but happy. She leaned into him, fitting against his side like she'd been made to be there. "That was quite a speech you gave," meant every word. "I know, that's why it made me cry." They stood in comfortable silence, looking out at the valley bathed in moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, and closer by, one of the horses nickered softly in the barn. "You ever wonder what your life would have been like if you hadn't come after me that day?" Sarah asked. Declan considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. I probably would have stayed sheriff until I got too old, then retired to some small house in town, lived alone, died alone, and been mostly forgotten. That's depressing. It's honest. The life I have now, the family and the love and the legacy, all of it came from one choice in a blizzard, from deciding that saving you was worth risking my life. And was it worth it?" He turned to face her fully, cupping her face in his weathered hands. "Sarah, you were worth it the moment I met you. Every day since has just been confirmation." She kissed him softly, a kiss that held 30 years of love and partnership and choice. "Take me to bed, Cowboy," she murmured against his lips. "We have another anniversary to celebrate properly." Declan laughed and swept her up in his arms, ignoring her shriek of surprise and his back's protest at the movement. He carried her over the threshold of their cabin, just like he had on their wedding night all those years ago, and kicked the door closed behind them. The morning sun rose over the Greenwood ranch, painting the valley in shades of rose and gold. In the big house, James's children were already up and making noise. In the cabin she'd built on the property after taking the teaching job, Rose was preparing lessons for the week ahead. In the new foreman's house, Samuel and his wife were feeding their infant son. And in the original cabin, the one that had started it all, Declan and Sarah Xavier slept peacefully in each other's arms, two people who'd been forced together by circumstance and had chosen to build something extraordinary from it. The blizzard that had brought them together was long past, but the love it had sparked burned as bright as ever, a beacon for their children and grandchildren and everyone who heard their story. This vow made by choice had become a lifetime of love. And that, as Declan had always said, was worth any storm.